There are places on this earth that don't make the textbooks. Places that archaeologists have quietly scratched their heads over for decades. Places where you stand and think, who built this, and why, and how did they know what they knew? Today, we're going to 3 of those places, all hidden within the ancient, rugged highlands of Armenia. 3 sites that most people have never heard of, but honestly should have. We're going to a plateau covered in standing stones with holes deliberately drilled through them. We're going to a mountain summit so high the air is thin, where ancient people carved thousands of images into black volcanic rock. And we're going to a Bronze Age mound in the shadow of one of the most famous mountains in the world, a mound that shouldn't have been capable of what it apparently was capable of. These aren't fringe theories. These are real places with real archaeology behind them, and the more you look into them, the more interesting it all gets. Let's go. The first place I want to take you to is called Karahunj. Sometimes it's spelled Karahun, sometimes Karahunj. The transliteration varies depending on who's writing about it, and its official archaeological name is actually Zorat's Karer. But whatever you call it, the site itself is striking. It sits on a plateau south of a town called Sisian, and the first thing you notice when you see photographs of it is the stones. There are a lot of them, standing upright, arranged across the plateau, some of them quite tall. And if you walk up close to them, and this is the detail that really catches people's attention, you'll see that many of them have holes in them. Not cracks from erosion, not accidental breaks. Holes that were deliberately created. Someone took the time, at some point in the ancient past, to bore holes through solid stone standing upright on a plateau. And they did it with enough intention and enough effort that the holes are clearly not random. Now, when you encounter something like that, the natural first question is, why? Researchers have put forward 2 main interpretations. The first is that Karahunj was a burial ground. The standing stones would then serve as markers, perhaps for graves, perhaps as boundary stones for sacred ground, perhaps as focal points for funerary rituals. That's not unusual for megalithic cultures. You find standing stones associated with burial all over the world, from the British Isles to the Korean Peninsula. The tradition of marking the dead with upright stone is ancient and widespread. But the second interpretation is the one that tends to capture people's imaginations a little more strongly. Some researchers look at Karahunj and see not a graveyard, but an observatory. An ancient astronomical observatory. The logic here is actually fairly straightforward when you lay it out. Standing stones positioned deliberately across a plateau can serve as sighting markers. If you know where the sun rises on the summer solstice, or where a particular star crosses the horizon at a particular time of year, and you mark that position with a stone, you've created a calendar. A physical, permanent calendar you don't have to write down. You just have to remember which stone to look through. Or in this case, potentially which hole. That's where the holes become especially interesting. Because a hole drilled through a standing stone is essentially a frame. A tube. A narrow window that dramatically limits your field of view to a very specific point on the horizon. If you put your eye to one of those holes and look through it at exactly the right moment, you might be looking straight at a rising star, or a setting sun on an equinox, or the moon at its most northerly point. We don't know for certain that's what the builders intended, and the honest answer is we may never know for certain. But as a hypothesis, it's far from ridiculous. It's actually quite elegant. What we don't have, unfortunately, is the kind of detailed written analysis of Karahunj's precise alignments that we have for better studied sites like Stonehenge or Nabta Playa. This site exists somewhat at the edges of mainstream archaeological attention, which means a lot of the detailed work that would settle these questions hasn't been done yet. Or, if it has been done, it hasn't been widely published in accessible form. And that's kind of the theme running through all 3 of today's sites. They're real, they're remarkable, and they're waiting for a lot more serious attention than they've received. The second site is called Ughtasar, and to visit it in person, you need to be in reasonably good shape. It sits at over 3,000 meters above sea level, that's roughly 10,000 feet. At that altitude, the air is noticeably thinner. Every step takes a little more out of you. The landscape is dramatic and exposed, and the stone underfoot is dark, volcanic. That dark volcanic stone is part of why Ughtasar is so visually striking today, because carved into it, covering it in places, are petroglyphs, ancient rock carvings. Not a handful, not a small cluster. A remarkably dense concentration of them spread across this high-altitude plateau in numbers that take your breath away in the same way the altitude does. Petroglyphs are among the oldest forms of human artistic expression we know of. The word itself just means rock writing, from the Greek words for rock and to carve, and humans have been making them on every inhabited continent for tens of thousands of years. You find them in the Sahara, you find them in the American Southwest, you find them in Scandinavia, you find them in Central Asia, in Siberia, in Australia. But even within that long global tradition, a site like Ughtasar stands out because of its density. When you have a concentration this high in a single location, it usually means the site held special significance. People didn't just wander by and carve something. They came here, repeatedly, perhaps over centuries or even millennia. This was a place that mattered. The imagery at Ughtasar is varied, as it tends to be at major petroglyph sites. Animal figures are common, geometric shapes appear, human-like forms, scenes that could be hunting expeditions or ritual processions or astronomical notations or simple records of daily life. The frustrating truth about petroglyphs is that without a cultural context to decode them, we're often looking at a library in a language we don't fully speak. We can see that meaning was intended. We can sometimes guess at what that meaning was. But certainty is elusive. What we can say with confidence is this: someone thought this plateau was worth the climb. Over and over again, across what appears to be a very long span of time, people made the effort to get up to this high, exposed, dramatic location and leave something behind. Images carved deep enough into dark volcanic stone that they survive to this day. There's something humbling about that when you really sit with it. The people who made these carvings had no expectation that someone thousands of years later would be looking at them. They weren't making them for us. They were making them for themselves, for their communities, for whatever gods or ancestors or cosmological forces they believed were listening. And yet here we are, still looking. Ughtasar hasn't received the intensive professional study it deserves, which is a recurring frustration with sites of this type in regions that are geographically remote or politically complicated to access. A proper systematic survey, photographing, cataloging, and analyzing every petroglyph would take years and significant resources. The work is worth doing, it just, in many cases, hasn't been done yet. The third site today is one that comes with more archaeological documentation than the previous two. And it might be the most jaw-dropping of all three. It's called Metsamor. It sits northwest of Mount Ararat. Yes, that Mount Ararat. The one associated with Noah's Ark in the biblical tradition, the massive snow-capped peak that dominates the landscape of that region. And it takes the form of what archaeologists call a tell. A tell is basically a mound, but not a natural mound. A tell is what happens when a settlement is built, used, abandoned, rebuilt on top of the ruins, used again, abandoned again, and this cycle repeats over such a long span of time that the accumulated layers of human habitation literally build up into a hill. The ancient Near East is scattered with tells. They're almost a signature feature of the region. But Metsamor is special for several reasons. First, there are the walls. Cyclopean walls is the term used. Cyclopean masonry refers to construction using massive, irregular stone blocks fitted together without mortar. The name comes from the ancient Greek belief that only giants, specifically the Cyclopes from mythology, could have moved stones so heavy. At Metsamor, these walls are enormous. And they're not just big, they're sophisticated. The way the stones are fitted together shows real engineering knowledge. These weren't people randomly stacking rocks. Second, there's the metallurgy. This is where Metsamor gets genuinely extraordinary. The site was occupied from at least the Bronze Age, and during its peak period, it appears to have been a major center of metal production. And not rudimentary metal production, highly sophisticated metallurgical work. Researchers have found evidence at Metsamor of smelting and casting operations involving copper, bronze, lead, zinc, iron, gold, and silver. The number of metals represented here, and the apparent complexity of the operations associated with them, suggest that this wasn't a small local metalworking site. This was, by the standards of its era, an industrial center. A place where specialized knowledge about extracting and working metals was concentrated, practiced, and presumably taught and passed on. Some researchers have gone further and suggested that Metsamor may be among the oldest known sites of complex metallurgical production in the world, or at least in the broader region. That's a significant claim, and like all significant claims in archaeology, it comes with caveats and scholarly debate attached to it. But the physical evidence for advanced metal production at this site is real and documented. Third, and this is where the story intersects with the theme we saw at Karahunj. Some researchers believe that certain structures at Metsamor were built with celestial alignments in mind. The idea is that the people who lived here were tracking the movements of the sun and stars and incorporating that knowledge into their architecture and their sacred spaces. This wouldn't be unusual for cultures of this period and sophistication level. The ability to predict seasons, track celestial cycles, and organize a calendar around astronomical observations was enormously practical. It told you when to plant, when to harvest, when to expect floods, when to move herds to different pastures. The boundary between astronomical observatory and practical farming tool in the ancient world is considerably blurrier than we sometimes imagine. But at Metsamor, the suggestion goes beyond mere practical calendrics. Some researchers see evidence of a sophisticated cosmological worldview encoded in the site's layout and structures, a community that understood the sky not just as a weather system, but as a kind of sacred map. Metsamor was excavated in the Soviet era, beginning in the 1960s, and the finds from those excavations are preserved and studied. But like many sites from that period, the full analysis of what was found is still ongoing, and new interpretations continue to emerge as methodology improves and new questions get asked of old material. So what ties these three sites together, beyond the fact that I'm talking about them in the same video? A few things, I think. All three of them represent human communities doing things that we might be tempted, wrongly, to assume were beyond people living that long ago. Standing stones with deliberate holes for astronomical sighting. Thousands of carefully carved petroglyphs at an altitude that requires real effort to reach. Cyclopean walls and sophisticated multi-metal smelting at a Bronze Age mound. We have this instinctive bias toward progress, the idea that older automatically means simpler, more primitive, less capable. These sites are a quiet but persistent argument against that bias. The people who built Karahunj, who climbed to Ughtasar, who worked the metal at Metsamor, they were not less intelligent than us. They did not have our technology, our information networks, our accumulated scientific literature, but they had the same cognitive hardware, the same pattern recognition, the same capacity for sustained abstract thought, the same impulse to understand the world around them and mark that understanding in permanent material. And all three sites share another quality. They're underexplored. They exist in that zone of real, legitimate archaeological significance that hasn't yet received the sustained attention and resources it deserves. Part of that is geography. Part of it is the relative scarcity of funding for sites that aren't already famous. Part of it is the complexity of working in certain regions of the world. And part of it, honestly, is just the way archaeological attention distributes itself, which is uneven and not always correlated with importance. That's actually one of the reasons these kinds of sites are worth talking about. Not because we should manufacture mystery where none exists, not because we should pretend ancient people were building spaceports or receiving alien transmissions, but because real, legitimate mysteries are worth more attention than they sometimes get. The honest question of who built this, and why, and how, and what it tells us about the full range of human capability across time, that's a question worth taking seriously. We are living in an era where the tools available for studying the ancient world have never been more powerful. LiDAR mapping can reveal structures hidden under vegetation that no ground survey would find. Isotopic analysis of metals can trace their origins to specific geological sources. Ground-penetrating radar can map what's under a mound without digging into it. Ancient DNA analysis is rewriting our understanding of prehistoric population movements. The science has genuinely never been better. Which means there's real hope that sites like Karahunj, Ughtasar, and Metsamor will eventually get the rigorous, well-resourced investigation they deserve. And when they do, my guess is that what we find will be more interesting than anything we could have invented. The ancient world is bigger, stranger, and more sophisticated than the standard narrative often suggests. These three sites are just 3 data points in that much larger picture. If this kind of material interests you, and clearly it does, because you're still here, hit subscribe. Every week I go looking for the places and stories that don't quite fit the standard account. Sometimes the most important history is the history nobody's heard of yet. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.